singer who Simon described as having a voice like liquid gold.
Which coincidentally is also what Simon uses to wash his face. Liquid gold. It's Alice Fredenham.
For about 90 seconds in April 2013, a nervous beauty therapist from Hertfordshire turned a television studio into a room that forgot how to breathe. She walked out shaking, barely able to look at the judges, and by the time the last note of her song faded, one of the most notoriously hard-to-impress men on British television was calling her voice liquid gold. That clip would go on to rack up tens of millions of views. And then, almost as fast as she arrived, Alice Fredenham vanished. No scandal, no dramatic falling out, no tabloid meltdown, just silence. So what actually happened to her? Why did a woman who had the entire country talking about her walk away from the one thing that could have made her famous for good? The answer isn't a single dramatic event. It's a slow, human story about anxiety, bad timing, an industry that didn't know what to do with her, and a woman who eventually decided that peace mattered more than fame. It's also, in a strange way, one of the more hopeful stories to come out of reality television, because it doesn't end in bitterness or burnout. It ends in a choice. Let's go through the whole thing, from the very beginning, and see how a shaking, nervous beauty therapist became one of the most talked about singers Britain has ever produced, and then decided that wasn't the life she wanted. Alice Fredenham was born on April 14, 1985 in Harpenden, a quiet market town in Hertfordshire, not far from St. Albans. Long before anyone outside her hometown had heard her name, she was just a young woman training and working as a beauty therapist, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that pays the bills while a much bigger dream sits quietly in the background. She sang when she could, at weddings, at small local gigs, but she wasn't chasing a pop career or building a fan base online. She simply loved jazz and soul, the kind of music that rewards restraint rather than spectacle. Growing up around St. Albans and Harpenden, Alice was the sort of person friends would describe as talented but reluctant. Someone who could hold a room with her voice at a wedding reception, but who would never in a million years describe herself as a singer when asked what she did for a living. That gap between raw ability and self-belief would end up defining almost everything that happened to her over the next decade. There's a particular kind of singer who gravitates toward jazz standards rather than contemporary pop, and Alice fit that mold from the start. The music she loved, the Sinatra songbook, Ella Fitzgerald's phrasing, the slow-burning torch songs of a much older era, isn't built for belting or spectacle. It rewards subtlety, control, and a willingness to let a note breathe rather than push it. That's a demanding skill in its own right, but it's also a strange fit for the format of a modern television talent show, where producers and audiences alike are often drawn toward the loudest, most immediately impressive moments. Alice's gift was the opposite of flashy, which is partly why nobody, including Alice herself, expected it to translate into a viral sensation. Her first real attempt at the national spotlight didn't go the way anyone would have scripted it. In 2013, at 28 years old, she auditioned for The Voice UK, a show built entirely around the idea of judging singers by ear alone, with the coaches turned away in their chairs so looks and stage presence can't influence the decision. Alice sang "The Lady is a Tramp," a jazz standard that demands confidence and control. Not one chair turned. She walked off that stage having been rejected in the most public, most literal way a singing competition can reject someone. No one even wanted to see her face. Picture what that actually feels like. You spend months building up the nerve to even show up. You get through security, through the waiting rooms, through the pre-show interviews, and then you sing your heart out to 4 chairs that never move. There's no feedback, no consolation, no judge turning around at the last second to soften the blow. Just silence and the long walk back to the wings, knowing that millions of people watching at home just witnessed you fail in real time. For most people, that would have been the end of it. A humiliating no on national television is the kind of thing that convinces a person to quietly retire the dream and go back to normal life, to tell themselves that singing was always just a hobby anyway. Instead, within days, Alice did something that looks almost reckless in hindsight. She auditioned for Britain's Got Talent and told almost no one. Not her close friends, not her family, and by several accounts, not even the boyfriend she was with at the time. If it went badly again, she wanted to be the only one who knew. There's something quietly brave about that decision. Most people who get publicly rejected once go quiet for a long time before trying again in front of an audience. Alice gave herself no time to recover at all. She just went straight back into the fire alone, with nobody around her even aware she was doing it. What makes Alice's story compelling isn't just the outcome of that BG audition, it's the state she was in walking into it. She has spoken openly, in interviews given not long after the show aired, about the severity of her stage fright. This wasn't ordinary first-night nerves. It was the kind of anxiety that makes your hands shake, your throat tighten, and your mind convince you, seconds before you're meant to perform, that you don't belong there at all. And yet, when she stepped out under the lights and began singing My Funny Valentine, something shifted. Her voice was low, husky, deliberately unhurried. The opposite of the big, belting numbers BG contestants usually reach for. Amanda Holden was visibly moved. David Walliams called her performance close to otherworldly. And Simon Cowell, a man who has built a career on looking unimpressed, leaned forward and told her she sounded like liquid gold. The clip spread everywhere almost overnight. It wasn't just that people liked her voice. It was the contrast between her visible fragility backstage and the composed, sultry performance she delivered once the music started. That contradiction is exactly what made millions of strangers feel protective of her. She wasn't playing a character. She was a genuinely anxious person who had, for 3 minutes, found a way to push past it. Watching someone do that, watching real fear transform into real control live, with no second takes, is a very different experience from watching a confident performer who is always going to nail it. Audiences responded to the vulnerability as much as the voice itself. There was also an unusual side story running underneath all of this. The competing rivalry between The Voice UK and Britain's Got Talent, two shows fighting for the same slice of Saturday night audience, essentially airing versions of Alice's story within days of each other. Entertainment writers at the time couldn't resist pointing out the irony. The same voice that 4 professional coaches had rejected without even looking at her was, less than 2 weeks later, being called one of the best things to happen to reality television that year. It became a talking point in its own right, a kind of unintentional experiment in how much presentation and framing can shape the way an audience receives the exact same singer. Cowell later pushed back publicly against critics who suggested her nerves were exaggerated for sympathy, saying flatly that he had been there and that she had been terrified. Not performing terror, but actually experiencing it. That detail matters, because it's the thread that runs through the rest of her story. The anxiety that made her audition so moving was the same anxiety that would eventually make a full-time career in the public almost impossible to sustain. It's tempting, watching a viral clip years later, to see only the triumphant 3 minutes and assume everything that followed must have been easy. For Alice, the opposite was true. That audition was the exception, not the new normal, and living up to it night after night was never going to be simple for someone whose nervous system reacted to a stage the way hers did. In the days after her audition aired, the offers and attention came in fast. Interview requests, opportunities to perform, and, most significantly, real interest from a major record label. It's the dream scenario that every unsigned singer imagines. One performance, and suddenly the industry is paying attention. But dreams like that rarely arrive with the amount of preparation time a person actually needs to handle them well, and Alice was about to find that out in the most public way possible. Riding that wave of goodwill, Alice moved forward to the Britain's Got Talent semifinals, and this is where the story takes its first real turn toward heartbreak. She had planned and rehearsed one song. Close to the performance, she was encouraged to switch to a different one, a version of Cry Me a River, the jazz standard most associated with Ella Fitzgerald and later reimagined by other artists, instead of the song she'd spent weeks preparing. She made the change. It didn't work in her favor. Without the rehearsal time she needed, small mistakes crept into the performance, and the nerves that she'd managed to control during her audition came roaring back under the added pressure of a live semi-final with the whole country watching. She was eliminated that night. It's worth pausing on how brutal that timing was. She had gone from complete unknown to viral sensation to eliminated contestant in the space of a couple of weeks. There was no long, slow climb to soften the landing, just a rocket up and a very fast drop back down. For most of the acts on a show like Britain's Got Talent, there's a gradual build across the series. Audition, callback, judges' houses, or equivalent, weeks of preparation with vocal coaches and stylists shaping the act into something polished for a live final. Alice's rise happened so fast, driven almost entirely by an online clip rather than the show's own broadcast schedule, that by the time she reached the semifinal she was still, in many ways, the same unprepared, anxious woman who had walked out for her first audition. The infrastructure around her hadn't caught up with how big her moment had become. Alice has since said she doesn't look back on the experience with resentment. She's described feeling proud of reaching the semifinals at all and grateful for the platform it gave her, even if the ending wasn't what anyone hoped for. That's a strikingly level-headed reaction for someone who watched a dream slip away on live television. And it says something about how she chose to process the whole experience, not as a tragedy, but as a chapter that had run its course. Here's where a lot of viewers assumed Alice's career would properly begin. Not long after her run on BGT, Sony signed her to a demo deal. Not a full recording contract, but a real, serious step that plenty of reality show contestants never even get close to. It meant time in a professional studio, resources behind her, and a major label taking her seriously as more than a viral moment. But a demo deal is exactly what it sounds like. A trial, not a guarantee. Alice went in, recorded material, and then the partnership quietly stalled. It never developed into a full album release with major label backing. There was no dramatic public falling out reported, just an old story in the music business, where an artist's sound doesn't line up neatly with what a label thinks it can sell at scale. Alice's voice belonged to smoky jazz clubs and vintage soul records, not to the pop charts Sony was chasing at the time. Sometimes that mismatch is nobody's fault. It's just business. There's a broader pattern here worth understanding, because it's happened to plenty of reality television breakout stars before and since. A viral moment creates enormous, sudden demand. Labels, managers, and producers all want to move quickly to capture the attention before it fades. But converting a viral clip into a sustainable, marketable career requires a completely different set of skills and often a completely different sound than the one that made the clip go viral in the first place. Labels are typically trying to build something that will sell across formats, playlists, and years, not just replicate 3 minutes of raw emotion from a talent show stage. Alice's voice, gorgeous as it was, belonged to a different era of music entirely. The kind of phrasing you'd expect from a smoky supper club in the 1950s, not from a chart-focused pop release in the 2010s. That mismatch is common, and it rarely makes headlines the way the initial signing does because the deal quietly didn't progress isn't nearly as exciting a story as Star Sign's record deal. What followed was the first version of Alice's disappearing act. Her official website went dark. Her social presence, once a direct line to the fans who'd fallen for her audition, slowed and then stopped. There was no farewell post, no explanation, no taking a break, back soon. She just stopped showing up. For a public that had spent weeks being told she was the next big thing, the silence was confusing. But for someone dealing with real anxiety around performance and visibility, it was probably the only way to breathe again. Imagine spending months being recognized in the street, having strangers quote your own audition back to you, being asked in every interview when the album is coming, all while quietly knowing behind the scenes that the deal that was supposed to make it all worthwhile had stalled. Stepping back from that kind of pressure isn't disappearing. It's self-preservation. Here's the part of Alice's story that often gets skipped in the whatever happened to videos. She didn't actually vanish completely. She just stopped doing it on television. Around 2014 and into the following years, Alice began performing again, but in a completely different register. Small charity concerts, low-key local shows, the kind of gigs advertised through a flyer or word of mouth rather than a national broadcast. No cameras, no judges, no viral clip waiting to happen. For someone whose anxiety was tied so closely to scale and exposure, that shift made sense. A room of 80 people who came specifically to hear jazz standards is a very different pressure environment than a live broadcast watched by millions. With no major label backing her anymore, Alice turned to crowdfunding to make an album entirely on her own terms. She launched a campaign with a modest target, and her existing fan base, the people who'd never forgotten that BGT audition, came through, funding it well past the original goal. That's not a small thing. It meant there was still a real, dedicated audience willing to put money behind her, even years after she disappeared from mainstream visibility. The result was an album called Under the Covers, recorded with musician Patrick Phillips and eventually released through the independent label Cherry Red Records. It was a collection of jazz and soul covers unapologetically true to the sound that had made her famous in the first place. No attempt to chase trends, no reinvention for the streaming era. If anything, it doubled down on exactly what Sony had apparently decided wasn't commercial enough years earlier. There's something quietly defiant about that choice. Rather than trying to reshape her voice into something more marketable, Alice used her independence to make precisely the record she'd always wanted to make, on her own terms, funded directly by the people who believed in her rather than by an executive trying to predict chart performance. Critically, it was well received. Fans and music blogs praised the warmth and restraint in her voice, and longtime followers of her story pointed out that the record sounded exactly like the woman they remembered from that first audition. No artificial polish, no chasing of trends that didn't suit her. Commercially, though, it faced the challenge every